order. I call Dr Roz Savage to move the motion.
I beg to move that this House has considered E-petitions 653509 and 652949 relating to Israel and Palestine. It is an honour to serve under your chairmanship, Mrs Harris, and to introduce these two E-petitions on behalf of the Petitions Committee. I want to open this debate by expressing the grief and the horror that many of us have felt so strongly in response to the tragic events in Gaza and Israel, particularly over the last 14 months. I'm aware that this issue provokes powerful emotions in this place and across the country, and the roots of the broader Israel-Palestine conflict are deep and complex. I do not presume to speak as an expert on the history or politics of the Middle East, but I do speak as someone who deplores the killing of innocent, defenceless people, no matter what their place of origin, their religion, or the colour of their skin. The loss of life, including so many children, is truly heartbreaking, and my thoughts are with all those who have been injured, maimed, displaced, or bereaved. I would like to position this debate within the framework of a guiding principle. That principle being that none of us gets to choose where or when we are born, or into which religion. In that spirit, I hope that we can begin this debate from a shared reference point, that what we are watching in the Middle East is innocent people being punished unjustly for where and when they were born, that this is wrong, and that it is our duty as parliamentarians to do all we can to put a stop to this. The intensification of this conflict began on October the 7th, 2023, with Hamas's attacks on Israel, killing over 1,200 Israelis. As of October 2024, 154 hostages have been freed, but 101 remain in captivity, with 33 believed to have died. That 101 include British national Emily Damari, and I know across the political spectrum we are calling on the government to do all it can to ensure her release. Over the past year, the situation has escalated dramatically. The official death toll in occupied Gaza stands at over 42,000 Palestinians, although estimates from reputable sources claim that maybe as many as 186,000 have been killed. The humanitarian crisis in Gaza is dire, with approximately 90% of the population displaced at least once. I continue to call on the government to do all it can to secure an immediate bilateral ceasefire in Gaza, to put an end to the humanitarian devastation there, to bring the hostages home, and to open the door to a two-state solution, which is the only way to ensure dignity and security for Palestinians and Israelis alike. I'll give way.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. In July, this government called for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, but Netanyahu and his government refused to listen. The only way we can ensure a permanent end to the cycle of violence is by facilitating the establishment of a sovereign Palestinian state alongside Israel. So does the honourable member agree that it is time for the UK to join the 146 UN member states recognising the state of Palestine as a matter of urgency now?
I thank the honourable member for his intervention, and I will be coming to that point shortly. The conflict has expanded beyond Gaza's borders. I'm sure we all welcomed the recent ceasefire agreement in Lebanon, which was facing a humanitarian crisis of its own. But not just in Lebanon, across the whole of the Middle East, from Iran to Yemen, and of course most recently in Syria, we've seen the ramifications of this conflict. The first petition calls for the immediate recognition of Palestine as a state. It received 283,669 signatures and was started by Sandra Downs, who is in the gallery today. And I'd like to thank Sandra for her time last week in meeting to discuss her petition. I give way.
I thank the honourable member for leading on today's debate, and I'm glad that the government has publicly, repeatedly called for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, because the sheer scale of bloodshed and destruction is totally intolerable. Does my honourable friend agree that to attain lasting peace, we need to wholeheartedly commit to a two-state solution and recognise Palestine as soon as possible, because that's the only way that we can have a sovereign and viable Palestine alongside a safe and secure Israel?
Dr. Roz Savage.
I thank the honourable member for his intervention, and again I should be coming to that shortly. The UK bears a unique historical responsibility in this matter, stemming from the Balfour Declaration of 1917. While the declaration spoke of creating a national homeland for Jews in Palestine, it was silent on Palestinian political rights, setting the stage for decades of conflict. It paved the way for the Nakba, or catastrophe, in 1948, when 750,000 Palestinians were driven out of their homes. The UK government's position on Palestinian statehood, as stated by the Foreign Secretary on July the 30th this year, is: we want a credible and irreversible pathway towards a two-state solution, a safe, secure Israel alongside a viable, sovereign Palestinian state. We are committed to recognising a Palestinian state as a contribution to a peace process at a time that is most conducive to that process. I'll give way to the...
I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way, and I'd also like to pay tribute to Sandra Downs for starting this petition. Would the Honourable Lady agree with me that the recognition of a Palestinian state is actually the route for peace? It's not a byproduct of peace. And actually, we've seen the petulance of Netanyahu and the Israeli government for those of our European counterparts, such as Ireland, when they shut down an embassy, and the terrible reaction to Macron. Does the lady agree with me that it's actually a route to peace?
Dr. Roz Savage.
I thank the honourable member for her intervention, and I am going to make some progress now, as I am aware that I'm on a time limit and the clock is ticking. The Prime Minister has also expressed support for Palestinian statehood as a contribution to the peace process, describing it as an undeniable right of Palestinians. However, the government has not committed to a fixed timeline for recognition. Currently, the State of Palestine is recognised as a sovereign country by 146 other countries, representing just over 75% of UN member states. On December the 3rd, just earlier this month, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution calling for the creation of a Palestinian state based on pre-1967 borders, with 157 votes in favour, including the United Kingdom. A YouGov poll in early October found that 70% of respondents agreed that Palestinians have a right to a state of their own. I was proud to stand on a manifesto which committed to the immediate recognition of Palestine on 1967 lines, something which the Liberal Democrats have long been calling for. In fact, my honourable friend, the member for Oxford West and Abingdon, has tabled a bill to recognise the State of Palestine in each of the last 3 parliaments. Recognising Palestine is a tool which will inject hope into Palestinian society that having their own state is possible. We believe that this will help wrestle control back from the extremes at the edges of Palestinian society. Ultimately, if such a step was mirrored by other countries, widespread recognition of Palestine would have significant practical and political implications, including full participation in international organisations like the UN and its agencies, access to economic benefits, including predictable market access, membership in the IMF and World Bank, opening avenues for financial support, and establishment of full embassies in countries recognising its statehood.
Would you give way on that point?
I'll give way.
Rupahak.
Would she agree with me that now that more than half of EU nation states recognise Palestine, and the UK does recognise it at the ICC and in UN structures, in UN agencies, it does seem a bit inconsistent that it's a long-standing policy of HM government of both parties for a two-state solution if we're only recognising one of those states?
Dr Roz Savage.
Thank the honourable member for her intervention, and I do agree. Given that the Prime Minister and his Foreign Secretary have both committed in principle to Palestinian statehood, and that the majority of the international community has already recognised the statehood of Palestine, we might validly ask what the government's criteria are for that time that is most conducive to peace, and why we are lagging behind the rest of the world, dragging our feet on this issue. I'll give way.
President-elect Donald Trump has appointed or nominated Mike Huckabee as the next US ambassador to Israel. Is she worried, like me, that a man who has called for a one-state solution would actually jeopardise, and that the UK government should make it clear to the US that we believe firmly in a two-state solution?
I thank the honourable member, and indeed, I'm conscious that I have less than 4 minutes left now. I'll just check in with... Yes, OK, keep it moving. The second petition, which received 107,316 signatures, demands the revocation of arms export licences to Israel. Under international and domestic law, the UK is required to prevent the transfer of military equipment and technology where there is a clear risk of it being used to commit or facilitate serious violations of international humanitarian law or human rights law. Between October 7th, 2023 and May 31st this year, 42 export licences were issued for military goods to Israel. The Campaign Against Arms Trade stated that the UK has granted arms export licences worth £576 million in total since 2008. 15% of the components that make up each F-35 aircraft used to bomb the Gaza Strip were produced in Britain. In December last year, then Foreign Secretary Lord Cameron decided not to suspend any export licences, stating that he was satisfied that there was good evidence to support a judgment that Israel is committed to complying with international humanitarian law. I give way.
Thank you, Chair. Would the honourable friend agree with me that it is unjustifiable to continue the sale of arms to Israel, especially now when there are concerns about Israel's compliance with international humanitarian standards? UNRWA cannot deliver the desperately needed aid to Gaza because of the IDF's aggression to them as aid workers, and we need to deal with this.
Dr Roz Savage.
I wholeheartedly agree with my honourable friend. In September 2024, the new Foreign Secretary announced the suspension of around 30 export licences to Israel, including components for military aircraft, helicopters and drones, as well as items facilitating ground targeting. A constituent wrote to me to say that while this is a national and international issue, it also feels profoundly local to them, as there are factories producing military components for export to Israel in Cheltenham, Bishop's Cleeve, Ashchurch, Tewkesbury and Swindon, very close to my own constituency of the South Cotswolds. My constituent went on to say that they do not believe it is right for the South West to be so heavily complicit in crimes for which the International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for violations of international law, and which Amnesty International have concluded to be tantamount to genocidal in intent and impact. I will give way.
I'm grateful to Donald for
Alistair Carmichael.
because I agree very much with what she's saying on this point. The 2030 roadmap for UK-Israel bilateral relations, however, has an extensive provision within that in relation to defence and security. It's difficult to see how the current government could continue with this roadmap while suspending arms sales. Will she join me in calling for the Minister to clarify today the status of that roadmap with the current government, because it was a document that was entered into...
Dr Roz Savage.
Thank my honourable friend for his intervention, and likewise look forward to the Minister's statement on the matter. Palestinian children, the petition states, Palestinian children have been made orphans, people have been crushed by buildings in airstrikes, and there have been many other tragedies. Arms that have been partly manufactured in the UK appear to be being used in the current military action in Gaza. We believe the UK government is on the wrong side of history and must stop the sale of arms to Israel. I stood on a commitment to ensure better controls of the UK's arms exports to countries with poor human rights records. Liberal Democrats have been calling for a presumption of denial to those countries listed as human rights priority countries by the Foreign Office, which includes Israel. Accordingly, we have supported a full suspension of arms sales to Israel, and indeed I believe that my honourable friend, the member for Kingston and Surbiton, was the first leader of a major UK party to do so. In conclusion, I will say again that these are complex issues with no easy answers, but I would like to hark back to the guiding principle I stated at the outset, that it can never be right to punish human beings for the time and the place of their birth. I'll give way.
Does the honourable member agree with me that in order to stop the atrocities from being committed, humanitarian aid to go into Gaza and ensure the return of the hostages to Israel and have the sovereign state of Palestine together with a safe and secure Israel, we need to do what we can urgently to achieve the immediate and permanent ceasefire?
Thank my honourable friend for his intervention. I do wholeheartedly agree. As we debate these petitions, we must consider how the UK can best contribute to lasting peace in the region, what role we should play in supporting Palestinian statehood and ensuring Israel's security, and how we can align our arms export policies with our commitment to international law and human rights. I'm sure that members will reflect this in their contributions to the debate today. The question of a sustainable solution in line with international law to this long-running conflict is not an easy one to answer. However, the widespread public support for these petitions demonstrates that the British people want the UK government to play its part in helping to end the appalling suffering that we have witnessed over these past 14 months and over the decades prior. I will close this opening statement with a quote from Nadim Ahmed. "From the seeds of hope, the tree of peace shall grow, sheltering both nations."
Thank you. If members could please sit. As you can see, it is very overly subscribed. I will be setting a time limit of 4 minutes, but I anticipate if interventions continue where they have done, that will be reduced. If you were on my list to speak, you need to be sitting at the table. Any member who's made an intervention and is not down to speak, can you please make way for members who are waiting to speak? Nobody else? I've got members on this list who are standing on the edge. Can I also remind members who are taking interventions, as generous as that may be to the person you are allowing in, that means the people at the bottom of the list are not going to have an opportunity to speak. I will leave that to your judgment. Thank you. I now call on... the question is that this House has considered E-petitions 653509 and 652949 relating to Israel and Palestine. And I call the Chair of the Business and Trade Select Committee, Ian Byrne.
Mrs Harris, thank you very much indeed. It's a pleasure to speak in this debate. And let me start with first things first. I utterly condemn the attacks of the 7th of October. I utterly condemn the kidnap, the torture and the murder of hostages by Hamas. And I utterly deplore and condemn the destruction of Palestine and Palestinian life that has now ensued. That destruction is now so complete that Israel is in risk of turning Gaza to a desert and calling it peace. That prosecution of the war is now so brutal that the Foreign Secretary himself said on the 2nd of September that any exports of weapons here leads to a clear risk that they might be used to commit or facilitate a serious violation of international law.
On that point, my good friend give way.
I really appreciate my good friend for giving way. On that point, in terms of arms sales, does my honourable friend agree with me that the UK government needs to make a different decision about F-35 parts and think about employing a ceasefire immediately and cease to selling arms to Israel and impose sanctions for an ending peace?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and let me come on to exactly that argument, because the Foreign Secretary was followed by the Secretary of State for Business and Trade, who said now that there are significant risks about Israel's record of compliance. In court, His Majesty's government has said it bluntly in its opening statement on the 12th of November 2024. I quote, "Israel is not committed to complying with international humanitarian law." And yet the government has not cancelled all licences. It has cancelled some, but it has not cancelled all. And indeed, it has kept the licences for F-35 parts open. Now, last week in front of our committee, the Defence Minister, I won't give away because time is so short, last week in front of my committee, the Defence Minister said it is technically possible to track these parts, but it is contractually impossible. Indeed, Lockheed Martin supplied me with a letter to say that if I want to know anything about the parts, I need to address our queries to the Department of Defence in the United States. The government defends its case by pointing to the 28 words that allow it to make it up as it goes along when it comes to weapons exports. And those were the words actually written by the last government, published in the House on the 8th of December 2021. And they say this, they say the application of these criteria, the selective licensing criteria, will be without prejudice to the application to specific cases of specific measures as may be announced to Parliament from time to time. And there you have it. But of course what the Minister did not explain is clause 1B in the criteria. Clause 1B says the government will not grant a licence if to do so would be inconsistent with the UK's obligations under the UN Arms Trade Treaty. And of course the UN Arms Trade Treaty, Mrs Harris, is really very, very clear. Article 7 requires this government as a signatory to assess any items that we may be seeking to export. And if there is an overriding risk of the use of these weapons to commit or facilitate a serious violation of international humanitarian law, I quote, "The exporting state party shall not authorise the export." Now, if there was any question, if there was any doubt, if there was any dispute about whether F-35 parts that we supply could be used in such a way, then perhaps the government would have a case for keeping these licences open. But there is not any doubt, dispute or question about the government's analysis of F-35 parts, because in its opening statement to the High Court on the 12th of November 2024, it said this: "The F-35 carve-out accepts that there is a clear risk that F-35 components might be used to commit or facilitate a serious violation of international humanitarian law." We now have the ICJ advisory, we have the arrest warrants, we have the government's own assessment. I cannot now see how this government can legally defend a position to keep these arms export licences open.
James Shannon.
First of all, start by making my position very abundantly clear. I have been and always have been a steadfast friend of Israel. My commitment to the State of Israel is rooted in its right to exist as a secure and democratic homeland for the Jewish people. This principle for me is non-negotiable. I hope that my remarks today will reflect both my empathy and my unwavering belief in Israel's right to defend itself. Those who champion such measures as the ban on arms sales to Israel fail to acknowledge the existential threats that Israel faces daily. On the 7th of October, just to remind the House, Hamas murdered some 1,200 people who were slaughtered that day, including babies, children and elderly civilians. I have to be blunt, Madam Chair. The scale of barbarism we saw was unthinkable. The world witnessed graphic evidence of men beheaded, women raped and children murdered. If we in this House fail to stand unequivocally against the level of evil, we fail humanity itself. Hamas does not aim for coexistence or peace. Its very charter calls for Israel's destruction. To suggest, I'm going to keep to the 4 minutes. I'm sorry about that. I normally do, but I'm going to follow the rules of the chair. As this petition does, that we deny Israel the tools it needs to protect its citizens is deeply misguided. At the same time, Madam Chair, it is essential to acknowledge the human cost of the conflict in Gaza. Thousands of innocent Palestinian civilians, many of them children, have tragically lost their lives as well. Their suffering cannot and must not be ignored. It is Hamas's strategy of using civilians as human shields, embedding its terror infrastructure in hospitals and schools and residential areas. To quote Brigadier General Doran Gavish, Hamas deliberately targets civilians while hiding behind its own population. They hide amongst the skirts of the women and the children. That's what Hamas does, because their whole goal is the destruction of Israel. While I respect the aspirations of Palestinian people, I firmly believe that the path to peace lies in negotiations, not unilateral declarations. Israel has repeatedly extended its hand in peace, most notably through the Oslo Accords, but it has been met time and time again with rejection and violence. This brings me to the concept of a two-state solution. I believe in a two-state solution, by the way, and I support it in principle. But I say this, let's be very clear, peace cannot coexist with the likes of Hamas. Any discussion of a future Palestinian state must begin with the dismantling of terrorist organisations that perpetuate hatred and violence. Can we hope for a lasting peace that allows Palestinians to thrive alongside Israelis in safety and dignity and prosperity? I hope we can. Abandoning Israel would have dire consequences, not only for the Middle East but for global stability. Israel is a cornerstone of Western values in a region plagued by extremism and authoritarianism. To weaken Israel is to embolden its enemies, including Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas and other forces of radicalisation that threaten not just Israel but the wider world. Israel's existence is not just a matter of geopolitics, it is a beacon of hope and freedom in a turbulent region. We must not allow, Madam Chair, we must not allow this beacon to be extinguished by those who seek its destruction. And as we debate these petitions, let us do so with compassion for all affected by this conflict. But let us also stand firm in our support for Israel's right for self-defence and its quest for peace. That's critical, and that's what Israel wants, but it has to be a peace with justice. To abandon Israel now in its hour of need will be a betrayal not just of an ally, but of the principles of freedom and democracy that this House and the democratic position holds dear. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Rachel Hopkins.
Your chairship, and we're rightly debating these important petitions today on the matter of arms sales to Israel and the recognition of the state of Palestine. My constituents in Luton South and South Bedfordshire care deeply about these issues, with over 1,300 people signing these petitions in total. However, that's only a fraction of the amount who've reached out to me since the devastating conflict began. Since October 2023, I received thousands of emails from people horrified by the events we've seen unfolding on our TV screens and on social media. And I share the concerns my constituents have expressed. We are now past the one-year mark since this terrible conflict began, and every day we're watching the damage and destruction of the lives of Palestinian people in Gaza. The priority for all of us, of course, is an end to this brutal conflict. And that... I'll give way to my friend.
Thanks for that. I thank the 543 constituents in Bedford and Campster who signed the petition to recognise the state of Palestine immediately. But does my honourable friend agree with me that after a year of Israel's unprecedented bombardment and destruction of Gaza, which has led to massive human suffering and overwhelming evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity, it's our obligation, it's our duty to recognise Palestine state now?
Rachel Hopkins.
Thank my friend for making an excellent point. So the priority for all of us, of course, is an end to this brutal conflict, and that brings me on to the first of the petitions, which directly relates to the UK arms sales to Israel. I respect the swift action taken by the Foreign Secretary when Labour took office to review existing arms licences, and subsequently the decision to suspend several licences to Israel, where the government had concluded there was a clear risk they might be used to commit or facilitate a serious violation of international humanitarian law. However, my constituents continue to be appalled by the death and destruction they're witnessing in Gaza and want the government to go much further. I've taken one intervention, sorry. This is deeply important to them, and they question why the government has not restricted arms sales to Israel completely, as so well set out by the Honourable Member for Birmingham Hodge Hill. So I'd be grateful if the Minister could set out the government's rationale on their position and how this position aligns with international law. We know that only an immediate ceasefire with the release of all hostages, as well as a huge increase in humanitarian aid, can begin to address the tragedy unfolding in Gaza, and that should rightly be the priority at this time. But in the long term, people in all the occupied Palestinian territories need hope of peace and a better future for their children. And I'm very proud this Labour government has made a manifesto commitment to provide that hope, pledging to recognise a Palestinian state. But as has already been raised, recognition is essential to make steps towards a peace process and to offer Palestinian people hope of equality and a future free from occupation and violence. My constituents are unwavering in their support for the Palestinian people and their right to self-determination, and they want the government to make this a priority. So I'd be grateful if the Minister could outline what steps the government are taking towards this. So we must continue to listen to those across our constituencies who are desperate to see an end to this conflict. Importantly, we must stand firm in our work with international allies and humanitarian agencies to ensure we bring about a renewed peace process which results in a two-state solution with a safe and secure Israel alongside a viable and sovereign Palestinian state.
John McDonnell.
Every week of last year, virtually, we've had a debate in this chamber or in the main chamber and questions asked. And then we go home and then we watch on television the bodies of children being dug out of rubble, body parts in some instances, those white wrappings around their bodies. And every debate we've had, we seem to have got virtually nowhere because the arms are still being sold, because the F-35, the very vehicle that's dropping the bombs and firing the weapons and killing those children, we're still supplying the essential parts to it. Certainly.
Thank you, Mrs Harris. Would the honourable member, or was the honourable member as shocked as I was to learn that, contrary to the UK's trade in F-35 parts being untraceable, as we were previously told it is, in fact, not only is it traceable, but the US government is tracking it, and the reason we don't have that information is that we haven't even asked them.
John McDonnell.
One of the frustrations, and I'm careful of my language here, but one of the frustrations in this debate as well is to be told the truth about what's happening and what's contributing to the murders that are taking place. I think unless we can stop this, unless we can prevent the UK participating, I think we'll all be implicated. I think history will judge us all for not doing enough to stop this. I'm pleased that the petition has taken place, and I'm pleased at the numbers. I congratulate those people who have organised it. But the petition is a sense of the frustration that's felt out there and the real depth of anger. I've been on virtually every national demonstration now, and actually they've been peaceful, but there's a level of frustration now I don't think we can contain anymore. And in our own communities, we're alienating old sections of our own community, not about Labour Party or other political parties, but from democracy itself. People say, you're an MP, you go to Parliament, why aren't you stopping this? It's no good you just keep on shouting on demonstrations. Why isn't democracy being exercised here to stop this? And I want to make just one point, which is because of the lack of action by government, yes, petitions are taking place, but other people are taking direct action and they're being imprisoned. It's sub judice for me to mention any individual case, Chair, and I won't. But Palestine Action took direct action to close down an arms factory that was supplying the goods, the materials for the F-35 and also the drones. Those people were arrested under counter-terrorism powers, and they were detained under those counter-terrorism. They're young people, a lot of them young women, some of them just starting out at university. They did, to be honest, they exercising their influence and power because we failed to exercise ours. And now a number of them, some are being in court, and when they're in front of a jury, they usually win in the case. But now a number of them will be in prison from last March until next November, when their trial is listed, and they'll be on remand.
I remind the honourable member that it is sub judice and we should not be talking about.
I'm careful about not mentioning any names. I'm raising the issue of the process itself, Chair, which is the use of counter-terrorism powers against direct action groups. And the last government even came forward with proposals and discussions about prescribing Palestine Action as a terrorist organisation. I'm hoping the government isn't even going anywhere near that. But I tell you, these people that are in prison at the moment, why are they in remand at the moment? Why can't they be tagged before their trial comes up next November? A number of them most probably will be proved innocent, but they'll have served nearly 2 years in prison. For what? For trying to do what we're failing to do, preventing this government supplying the arms to a regime that's killing children. So I say to the government, it's time to act now. All arms licences need to be closed down. And if it's a matter, as the honourable gentleman says, well, it's about defending Israel, well, let's have a conversation with Israel itself about how you supervise that defence internationally, rather than using that as an excuse to kill children. I've had enough of coming back here every week, as you can tell, Chair. We need now action from this government.
Sarah Smith.
Last week, a needs assessment carried out by the Gazan NGO sponsored by the War Child Alliance charity revealed that the psychological trauma of young people in Gaza living through the ongoing war. This assessment was carried out back in June, but the results are devastating. 96% of children feel death is imminent. 79% are suffering from nightmares. 49% of children wish to die because of the war. This makes for distressing reading and highlights the awful plight of Gaza's civilians. And we know the destruction of the war. We want to see that full and immediate ceasefire and for the hostages to be released. And we must continue to urge the government to uphold international law and enforce further sanctions as necessary.
No, we'll never give way.
I will give way.
Seamus Logan.
Giving way. Would you agree with me that killing civilians through hunger, cold, illness, exhaustion, fear and torture is every bit as reprehensible as bombing and shooting to death 45,000 or more civilians, mostly innocent women and children, and that the only way to force Israel to stop is to completely cease providing them with arms?
Sarah Smith.
I do agree with the honourable gentleman. We must also recognise the Palestinian state, of course, as that route towards the two-state solution. We know the United Kingdom is firm in its support for UNRWA, and I welcome the recent announcement for £13 million of further support for UNRWA. But it's not good enough if that support and those vital aid cannot get through. Far too many innocent people have died in this conflict, and this devastating recent data just shows the specific impact it's having on children and young people. This has to end. I thank you to the constituents in Hyndburn who've contacted me about this petition and welcome the work of those that organised it. We must continue and move forward today to make sure that we are working towards peace in the region and the end to this devastation. Thank you.
O'Hara.
Thank you, Ms Harris. And I want to add here my millions of people across these islands who are demanding an immediate ceasefire, a release of all the hostages, and end to all UK arms sales to Israel, and for the UK government to officially recognise the State of Palestine. Since the atrocities of October the 7th, the civilian population of Gaza has been subjected to the most brutal onslaught imaginable. Every day, 10 children lose at least one of their limbs, making this tiny strip of land home to the largest population of child amputees in history, something which does not happen by accident. I would, if you can apologise, around 4/5 of those killed were killed while inside residential buildings, and the Minister knows that residential buildings are not legitimate targets under international law. But we all know, Minister, that so much of what's happened since October 23 has been a violation of international law. Indeed, Lord Cameron let it slip at the Foreign Affairs Committee that the UK has long known that Netanyahu was imposing a collective punishment against the population by controlling their water supply. We had hoped that things would be different with a change of government. It has not been the case. And by choosing to deny the evidence of their own eyes in order to supply Netanyahu with the weapons he needs, the UK is complicit, and he's giving Netanyahu and his government a degree of international respectability that he desperately craves. This is a shameful episode in UK foreign policy, one which will long be remembered and will not be without consequence. Because when it comes to international law, everyone can see the blatant application of double standards. In September, the Minister of State at the Foreign Office told this House that intentionally directing attacks on civilians is a war crime. Attacks that threaten power, heating, water and impact the safety and livelihoods of millions of Ukrainians is a war crime. And she was absolutely right. But why is this government, and the previous one, able to call out Putin's war crimes the moment they happen, but seem utterly incapable of doing so when the perpetrator is Netanyahu and the victims are Palestinians. Our system of international law is fragile. It always has been fragile, but operating in such a clear double standards in its application and enforcement is a surefire way of its complete destruction. Ms Harris, these petitions, these mass demonstrations that we have seen, it tells me that this government are miles behind the people who want to find a solution, one in which all arms are suspended to Israel and one which would recognise the Palestinian state. People feel so badly let down in terms of this government defending international law, because there seems to be very little difference between the situation now and the situation of the last government. And what changes we have seen have been superficial and cosmetic. It wasn't unexpected, but perhaps we dared to hope that they would be better than the last lot. But there are voices in this place, many of whom we will hear today, loud, persistent voices who will continue to speak up for international law, for justice and for accountability and for peace. And those people in this House, we will continue to shine a light where too many people do not want a light to be shone. And we'll keep doing it, not just for the Palestinians, but we'll do it whenever we see the powerful and the privileged abusing the human rights of the powerless and ignoring wilfully international law.
Andy Slaughter.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I can be very brief because this speech has been honed by repetition over the past year since Israeli tanks and troops and planes went into Gaza against Hamas, but significantly against the civilian population without discrimination. And it mirrors on a larger scale the previous attacks on Gaza over the past 15 years, on which I have seen with my own eyes. The Minister here could not be more, who's going to reply to the debate, could not be more empathetic to the situation. He could not be more sympathetic to the complaints from all parties. But there has been a lack of action from this government as from the previous government. And that lack of action speaks louder than any palliative words. There has not yet... I will once very briefly.
Can I just... I would just like to...
Simon Orfer.
I would just like to say to the Honourable Member, would he celebrate the work of Standing Together, which is a group of Israelis and Palestinian people working side by side for peace, and would he support them in their call for suspending the arms transfers to Israel and immediately recognising the state of Palestine?
Andy Slaughter.
It's a fantastic group, and it's one of many Israeli and multinational groups which are protesting, and we've seen that on the streets of Tel Aviv, as we have around the world. There is yet to be, however, any substantive action by the UK, and war crimes are being committed in Gaza. The evidence is clear. It's clear from journalists, and many brave journalists have been killed. It's evident from the actions of the International Criminal Court and from the ICJ, both the advisory opinion and the South African case, and the Irish government should be praised for their association with that case just last week. From votes and decisions and debates in the UN, from the evidence of NGOs on the ground and the evidence of medics. And the remedies are also clear. There are many steps that the UK government could take. It could look at trade. It could look at settlement trade. Why is that allowed to continue? It could look at preferential trade agreements with Israel. It could look at arms sales. It should certainly be re-examining and asking the law officers to re-examine on a weekly basis the actions that UK-supplied arms are being used for, not just in Gaza, but across the occupied territories. Could look at sanctions against settlers going much further than the few that have happened so far, and sanctions against members of the Netanyahu government, particularly the extremists like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. Why have they not been taken so far? And we could also look at the question of recognition. It's the policy of the government to recognise the state of Palestine at some point during negotiations. Well, we're a long way from negotiations at the moment, and there seems no reason whatsoever not to allow recognition. I will once more, and I won't take my time.
Gentleman for giving way. Would he agree with me that actually now is the time to provide hope to Palestinians, if we've got any hope of a political solution, for this country to follow our allies in recognising the state of Palestine, not least when you've got extremists like Smotrich in the Israeli government who are looking to annex the West Bank?
Well, I couldn't agree more. I cannot think of a single reason why we are not moving, as many other European countries have done, towards immediate recognition. And what I heard previously from government was, well, we don't want to go it alone. We don't want to do it. Well, we're not just going it alone. We're going behind the curve in relation to this. So my final point, and I don't want to take all my time, is to ask one question of the government, which is why these actions haven't been taken. And I'd like to hear a coherent response, because what is being said is either we won't take action against Israel because it is an ally, or sometimes you have to speak sternly to your allies as much as you do to your foes, or because Israel will ignore what we say, and therefore it shows us as a weak country. Well, that is a counsel of despair. Or it may be that we are waiting until such point as something more extreme happens, that aid no longer goes into Gaza following what is happening with UNRWA, or that there is annexation that has been threatened of the West Bank, and then we would take some action. That's too late. Now is the time. Actually, yesterday, last year, 10 years ago was the time. But now is the time to take action, and I would love to hear from this Minister, who is not only expert in the field, but I know cares very much about these issues, what action his government is going to take.
Will Forster.
Thank you, It's a pleasure to serve under your leadership with following these two really important petitions. A significant amount of my constituents of Woking have signed. Liberal Democrat policy on this issue is clear. British-made arms must not be sold to countries that are breaching human rights law. This principle is not just a moral standard, it is a legal one. But when it comes to Israel, the British government has failed to demonstrate transparency. Despite repeated calls, ministers have not released their own legal advice on whether arms exports to Israel align with international law. Given the ongoing cases at the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, the British public have a right to know whether the government is upholding its own arms export regime, and I look forward to hearing the minister's confirmation on that later. The human cost of war is always staggering, and the last 14 months shows that is true here as well. Tens of thousands of people in Palestine and Israel have lost their lives. These horrific numbers represent families torn apart, communities devastated. According to data from the United Nations and other organisations, Israeli government attacks have damaged or destroyed more than half of Gaza's homes, 80% of its commercial facilities, 87% of its school buildings, and left healthcare systems barely functioning, with just 17 of 36 hospitals only partially operational. Over two-thirds of Gaza's road networks and cropland have also been obliterated. In the wake of this destruction, the ICC's chief prosecutor has stated that there's reasonable grounds to believe that Prime Minister Netanyahu bears criminal responsibility for war crimes and crimes against humanity.
Will the honourable member give that point?
I will.
So on that point, does the honourable member
Maguire.
That the UK must uphold its obligations to the International Criminal Court by supporting investigations into alleged war crimes in the region and enforcing any resulting rulings?
I completely agree. I completely agree with my honourable friend for Epsom. We must support the International Court investigations and uphold whatever they find. The Prime Minister of Israel bears criminal responsibility, but it doesn't stop there. It doesn't stop with him. The former Israeli Defence Minister, Gallant, is also under investigation. And this brings me to the urgent need for targeted sanctions against those in Israel's leadership who are directly fueling the conflict and undermining the chance for peace. Israel's current finance minister, Smotrich, is a prominent advocate of settlement expansion, opposes Palestine statehood and supports the full annexation of West Bank. I won't anymore due to time, sorry. He has even encouraged the forced transfer of Palestinians out of these territories. The current Minister for National Security, Ben Gvir, has a troubling past. He has been charged more than 50 times and convicted in 8 cases, including incitement for racism and support for a terrorist organisation. Those 2 individuals need to be sanctioned by the UK, and I look forward to the Minister's response on that. But this violence is at risk of escalating even further, and we can't allow that. That's why the UK should stop selling arms to Israel. It's time for the government to demonstrate leadership, halt those arms sales where there's evidence of human rights abuses, impose sanctions on those people that I've mentioned and others pushing a conflict, and lead an international effort to stop the bloodbath and rebuild Gaza. Thank you.
Helen Hayes.
Thank you, Mrs Harris. It's a pleasure to see you in the chair today. I'm grateful to the Petitions Committee for securing this important debate, and to everyone from my constituency of Dulwich and West Norwood who has signed these important petitions. Both the war in Gaza and the horrific actions in Israel on the 7th of October, which started it, are intolerable. 14 months on from the attack which claimed 1,200 lives, more than 40,000 Palestinian men, women and children are dead, and 101 Israelis are still being held hostage. Palestinians in Gaza have been displaced, often multiple times. Aid has been repeatedly prevented from reaching the population, and the risk of preventable diseases has continued to rise. There is an horrific humanitarian crisis unfolding in Gaza.
Will my honourable friend give way?
Richard Ferguson. Kirsten Sullivan.
Thank you, Mrs Harris. With medics working in intolerable conditions, witnessing unimaginable horrors without the very basics to treat the civilian casualties, does my honourable friend agree with me that safe and secure routes to allow medical aid into Gaza must be prioritised immediately without delay?
Helen Hayes.
I certainly agree with my honourable friend on that point. I welcome the actions that the UK government has taken since the election in July. But the UK government has found that there is a clear risk that UK arms components are being used by Israeli armed forces in Gaza in ways that breach international law. It is welcome that the new government took swift action to suspend some arms licences, but when there are breaches of international law, the government must be clear that it takes action to ensure compliance with the law. The importance of the F-35 programme is understood, but the argument that it is justifiable in the current circumstances to carry on with business as usual, frankly, doesn't hold water. If the government believes in the rules-based international order, it cannot recognise breaches of international law and then ignore them. The government's position on the F-35 licences is not defensible. Secondly, I'd like to focus on the importance of the recognition of the State of Palestine as an essential precondition for a successful peace process. I've had the privilege of visiting Israel and Palestine twice. I've seen firsthand how oppressive the Israeli occupation is for Palestinians in the West Bank, how every day ordinary Palestinians face systems and actions which seem devised to frustrate their normal activity and grind them down, how widespread the practice of illegal settlement is, and how it seems designed to ensure that there can never be a viable landmass to form a state of Palestine, how Palestinians are forced to live under different laws, travel on different road systems, live in different areas and attend different schools. It is the position of the UK government to support a two-state solution. But that position is currently rejected by the government of Israel. Recognition of the State of Palestine is an important counteraction to that rejection. It would send an immediate and powerful message that the UK is serious about the only viable route to peace, which is a two-state solution. It must also be accompanied by a much stronger position on illegal settlement and settler violence. Again, we cannot pick and choose which aspects of international law we uphold. Taking a stronger stance on illegal settlements and settler violence in Palestine is not only the right thing to do, but it sends a message to other governments around the world that the UK Parliament is serious about the rules-based international order. Israeli settlements in the West Bank are illegal. There should be a process accompanying recognition, supporting and strengthening the Palestinian Authority and building the full capacity of a functioning state. And with recognition, of course, comes responsibilities and accountability. But I believe recognition of a Palestinian state cannot continue to be delayed. To do so is simply to further reduce the possibility of the two-state solution that the government supports ever coming to fruition.
Shaukat Adam.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Ms Harris. And I would really like to thank the Honourable Member for Cotswold South for securing this vital debate. And I'd also like to thank Sandra Downs for her e-petition and the thousands and thousands of people who signed it, including those in my constituency of Leicester South. I would like to also mention to the Honourable Member for Cotswold on her proclamation of the Balfour Declaration, which indeed did promise a Jewish land for a Jewish people. But there was also a caveat to that statement. And that caveat was this, that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. It appears the caveat... I will...
I thank my honourable friend for taking an intervention, but I wonder if he would agree with me and share my fear that the statements of Israeli officials would suggest that they do intend to have a long-term presence in Gaza. And would he join me in condemning what is in effect the de facto annexation of parts of Gaza that's going on at the moment?
Shaukat Adam.
I thank my honourable member for that intervention. I certainly do agree, and I certainly do fear that myself too. We, of course, welcome the cessation of the 9% of the arms licence to Israel, but it's frankly woefully falling short of what is actually required. 30 out of 350 is too small and too little, especially the killing machines, which are the F-35 fighter jets, using machinery equipment that is made in our own country here. Many of my honourable members have already articulated the massacre that is taking place, with over 16,000 children murdered and 10,000 women killed. Not all of them were hiding behind the skirts of Hamas. Palestinians have been killed since 1948, before the invention of Hamas. Just overnight, a family, 10 Palestinians have been killed, including a family in a tent in northern Gaza City, including 2 parents and 2 children. They were not hiding behind the skirts of Hamas. We as a nation have a moral, political and legal duty to uphold international law and the rules of engagement during times of conflict. And under the Genocide Convention, we have a duty not only to prevent and punish genocide, but also to avoid actions that might assist or enable a genocide from happening. With that in mind, I want to raise one single issue with the Minister, which is extremely important and pressing. And that issue is surrounding the use of US air forces of British sovereign airspaces in Cyprus. According to Declassified, at least 13 US planes used by special forces, nearly all of them unmarked, have gone from Britain's Spalding Air Base in Cyprus to Israel since Labour took office on July the 5th and October the 10th. Most flights stayed in Israel for around 2 hours before returning back to Cyprus. Are we providing a base for the delivery of weapons to Israel, which would make us complicit in any war crimes and or genocide that is happening there? Thank you.
Taha Hali.
Thank you, Ms Harris. First of all, I'd like to thank the member for Cotswold South Cotswold for securing this debate, and also the thousands of my constituents in Birmingham, Hall Green and Moseley who have sent me emails and signed the petitions relating to today's debate and urging me to speak up on the extremely distressing situation in Palestine. The situation in Gaza is far beyond breaking point. In the past 14 months, we have seen Israel's deliberate assault on innocent people of Gaza. We have seen over 45,000 Palestinians killed, with over 100,000 injured, many of whom are innocent women and children. The death toll continues to rise every day, and the United Kingdom cannot remain complicit anymore. One step forward towards the change is to seize not only the 30 out of 350 arms export licences, but to seize each and every one of them, because we cannot allow Israel to destruct Gaza in the way that it is. The government, on one hand, says it wants to see a two-state solution, but to have a two-state solution, you have to recognise Palestine. And if you don't recognise Palestine, what does it actually mean? It is no more than warm words, and time for warm words is no longer a viable option as well. It is time for action, and that action has to be with the immediate recognition of Palestine as a statehood. If we don't recognise Palestine as a statehood and we advocate for a two-state solution, it means absolutely nothing. It means exactly... I will give her.
Stella Creasy.
I share his frustration because 10 years ago this place voted to recognise Palestine as a state. Many of us took part in that debate. Does he therefore agree with me now? We need to take that vote to the United Nations. That's where we misrecognise Palestine.
Tahi Ali.
I thank my honourable friend for raising that important point in terms of the vote that has happened here, in terms of it going to the United Nations. But the thing is, the United Nations is not democratic. It's a toothless tiger, because a single nation can stand up and veto that vote. And we've seen that time and time again. What we've got to do is choose the side of being on the right side of history, where 146 countries actually recognise Palestine as a state. We, for one, as United Kingdom, say the warm words that we are all in favour of a two-state solution. Before long, if what happens in terms of what Netanyahu wants in Gaza, where he wants Palestinians to leave to Lebanon and Egypt, there will be no Palestine to recognise. There will be no Palestinians left in Palestine or Gaza. This is the agenda of Netanyahu, and we cannot aid and abet that in terms of not recognising Palestine as a statehood. We have to be above that, and with immediate effect, without any further dithering, this government has to rise to the challenge and say enough is enough to Netanyahu. We will recognise Palestine as a state, and we will stop all sales of arms to Israel. And if it needs further sanctions than that, then we need to put further sanctions on that. Will the Minister, when he gets up to explain, Chair, explain why it is not the time that's right for recognising? That is no longer an excuse. Why the government is not in a position to recognise Palestine. To say the same rhetoric as the previous government, that when the time is right, we will recognise Palestine, does not cut the mustard anymore. We have to recognise the innocent children, men and women of Gaza that have died because of the genocide, plausible genocide that is being carried out by Netanyahu. Arrest warrants are out, ICJ rulings is out, many of the world leaders have called it a genocide, and we are still here debating whether we need to recognise Palestine as a state. It is shameful for this government, and it is shameful to be part of this debate here today, actually advocating for a recognition of Palestine when that should have happened many years ago, as my good friend has mentioned, and that vote has already happened. We need that vote again. We need to put it to this Parliament, and we need to carry out not only the wishes of the people out there, but extremely the wishes of every single parliamentarian in this chamber. Thank you, Chair.
Luke Taylor.
Thank you, Mrs Harris. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship for the first time. I would like to start by thanking my right honourable friend, the member for South Cotswold, for opening this debate, and to the petitioners for bringing these important issues to be debated in the House. I'm still deeply saddened by the events which took place on the 7th of October 2023. More than a year after these horrifying events, many innocent people are still dying on a daily basis. I would like to take this opportunity to extend my sympathies to all those who've lost loved ones and who are navigating life amongst all this destruction. The murder and abduction of over 1,000 civilians by Hamas terrorists on October the 7th, 101 of whom are still held to this day, must always be condemned, and these people should be released without delay. And it is also true that Israel's response has been hugely destructive. The Gaza Strip is now in the midst of a humanitarian catastrophe, with 90% of the population displaced at least once and critical infrastructure damaged or destroyed. And while we would be remiss to ignore the fact that this damage takes many forms, it is not just the deaths and permanent life-changing injuries that horrify us, but so too the psychological scars of being exposed to such combat. It is hard to quantify the extent of the trauma that adults and children in particular have experienced as a result of this conflict. And tragically, we must recognise that no matter how quickly this conflict ends, and it must end quickly, an entire generation of Israelis and Palestinians will be living with this horror for the rest of their lives. In October, I was part of a group of MPs who met with Sharon Lipschitz, whose parents were taken hostage on October the 7th, and whose father is still held by Hamas, as well as Standing Together, who are a progressive grassroots movement involving Jewish and Palestinian citizens of Israel standing against the occupation and for peace, equality and social justice. I heard firsthand the pain and anguish of the families of those on both sides of the conflict who only want to see a lasting peace. The Liberal Democrats have been consistent on this issue for decades. A two-state solution is the only way to guarantee that lasting peace.
My honourable friend give way.
I will.
Thank you to my honourable friend for giving
Thomas
way.
Morrison.
All of the political parties, the major political parties, went into the last general election saying that they would back a two-state solution and recognise the state of Palestine. Isn't it about time that this government shows leadership on the world stage and formally recognises Palestine straight away?
Luke Taylor.
I 100% agree, and I hope that we will hear the Minister speak with the courage and to confirm that that will happen. I continue. The dignity and security which both Palestinians and Israelis deserve can only be delivered by a two-state solution. That's why we called in our manifesto, as you said, for the immediate recognition of Palestine on 1967 lines, and why I reiterate that ambition today. Because our conscience demands that we do that which we can and play our part in order to accelerate a lasting peace. That is what responsible nations do. Recognition of the state of Palestine is within our gift to grant and can be done at any moment. And contrary to some cynicism, I believe it is a crucial first step to achieving the goal of lasting peace. It is important that the UK considers the role its arms exports play in the conflict. So I welcome the current halt of 30 licences, which is a good first step. However, now the UK needs to use every tool at its disposal in order to obtain the necessary bilateral ceasefire for a lasting peace. And therefore I conclude by echoing calls from across my party and in many parts of civil society for the government to stop all arms exports to Israel for now, so that we can ensure that British products are not being used in any potential breaches of human rights. So I encourage the Minister to enact the calls from the petitioners and have the courage to recognise the state of Palestine and suspend sales of arms to Israel so that we can play our part in securing a lasting peace in the region.
Ruth Cadbury.
Thank you, Mrs Harris. It's a pleasure to serve under you. And I'd like to congratulate all those involved in bringing these petitions to Parliament today, including my constituents who signed them. After 15 months of horror, the death and destruction has to stop. To address the petition regarding Palestinian statehood, the most important, the most immediate precondition must be an immediate ceasefire, the hostages released and adequate aid be allowed to flow. When I visited the West Bank for the third time in my life in 2017, I met with peace builders in West Bank, Jerusalem and Israel who reaffirmed my belief in a two-state solution, but who also told me how distant the prospect of peace appeared, even to them. We have seen a clear change in policy under the new UK government. Along with calling for a ceasefire, the government has restored funding to UNRWA, condemned attacks on UN peacekeepers in Lebanon, and committed to upholding the ICC's arrest warrants. The government remains committed to a two-state solution. The question we are debating today is how and when that might become a reality. At this moment in time, our efforts must be concentrated on providing humanitarian relief and on achieving a ceasefire. And it's from that an independent Palestinian state can emerge. Like many other honourable members and many of my constituents, I've watched aghast at the scenes of suffering in Gaza. We've seen hospitals burned, aid convoys bombed, and schools too, and the return of ghastly, anachronistic diseases like polio.
Again.
member. The destruction that's been wrought on Gaza and the people there, does she agree with me that in terms of an actual tactical manoeuvre by the State of Israel, it's catastrophically counterproductive, notwithstanding the punitive measures against Palestinians? It will not be a harbinger of peace for Israel. And actually, if the UK is a friend of Israel, a good friend would say, this far and no further, you must recant.
Ruth Cadbury.
Israel's behaviour towards Palestinians, as I saw 30, 40 years ago, only exacerbates the lack of chance of peace, because it builds in children's minds that peace is a long way off. And in that sense, I agree with the member. What we've seen over recent months goes beyond any reasonable definition of self-defence. It's a scale of destruction that has left Gaza in ruins. That the scale of destruction and human misery is so great is due to the disregard that Israel has shown towards international law and towards the rights of Palestinians. And I'm sure that Palestinian people may well take heart from Britain's decision to formally recognise them as a state. They might take greater comfort, though, from knowing that the bombs will stop falling from the skies above them. A two-state solution is still the only route to lasting peace, but we need a ceasefire now. And as well as causing intolerable suffering in Gaza, the conflict has helped distract from the continued unlawful expansion of illegal Israeli settlements in the West Bank. Way, way more than when I first went 40 years ago. This is in a violation of international law and provides one of the biggest obstacles to a lasting two-state solution. For as long as the conflict continues, illegal settlements and settler violence will continue, making the reality of Palestinian statehood all the more distant. We know that our government must do more to put pressure on Israel and to end the conflict in Gaza. And I want to ask the government to take note of the concerns of last week's Business and Trade Committee. Ms Harris, no conflict is inevitable, no matter how intractable. Within our lifetimes, we have seen conflicts resolved that threatened to outlive us. We must not let that happen again. We must end this grim inheritance. We must have peace.
Asbina Begum.
Thank you, Ms Harris. A few weeks ago, a surgeon broke down as he told the International Development Committee what he witnessed in Gaza, in particular drones descending after a bombing and shooting, yes, deliberately targeting children. He even spoke of wounds that he worried indicated some sort of artificial intelligence, literally expressing fears of autonomous drones hunting down children. Likewise, we are also aware of the long-standing partnership between the UK and Israel regarding drones and warfare, and the role of companies such as Elbit Systems, which is widely known. So can the Minister today clarify whether drones, either developed or made in the UK, are being used in this way, i.e. to shoot children or doctors? Or whether the F-35 fighter jets containing UK-made components are being used to slaughter Palestinian families and cause mass destruction. I will make a bit more progress. Can he categorically rule out any UK products being sent to Israel to be used in Gaza, including via indirect routes and shipping between partner companies? There is a particular chilling significance of the role of advanced weaponry and the reported use of artificial intelligence by the Israeli Defence Forces against starving civilians who have been trapped in a relatively small and increasingly uninhabitable pieces of land. Why is it that a modern and well-equipped army, which openly advertises that it has some of the most advanced precision weaponry in the world, is killing so many civilians on an unprecedented scale unless it is aiming to do so? Today, I know that my constituents, who are among the top signatories of both petitions, want to hear a clear condemnation of the actions of Israel from the Minister and not the political doublespeak that Israel must uphold international law in theory. Because we all know that they should uphold international law. But the point is that we all know that they are not doing so. My constituents also want a clear and unequivocal recognition of the right of self-determination for Palestinians, a right that is currently being brutally denied from them. And crucially, I know that my constituents want accountability for the role of the UK. as the close and staunch ally of a Prime Minister who is facing an arrest warrant for war crimes, as a country that continues to proudly profess that it stands firmly shoulder to shoulder with a regime that openly states its intention to destroy Palestinians as a people and then openly enacts this intention with a horrific, unprecedented war on civilians, wiping out entire multi-generational families. Indeed, a recent Amnesty International report concluded that, and I quote, Israel has committed and is continuing to commit genocide against Palestinians. I do wonder if the enormity of what has happened over the past year has been properly understood and whether the British political establishment fully knows the tremendous damage that has been done to democracy at home, the UK's reputation abroad, and indeed the standing of human rights benchmarks around the world. There is a complete disjunct between the majority of people and those who are meant to represent them. Beyond the political bubble, the hypocrisy and the double standards are plain for everyone to see. The disregard for Palestinian lives, the censorship, denial, and yes, the fact that UK-made weapons are being used to kill and maim civilians, 70% of which are women and children. There is no doubt everything that the UK has done, everything it continues to do, and everything it fails to do will forever haunt us.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Ms Harris, and I'm delighted we're having this debate today. And it's only come about because hundreds of thousands of people have signed signatures demanding that we have a debate about this. And I think it's a shame that a debate like this is held in Westminster Hall when it's of this significance, this important. It should be in the main chamber to indicate how seriously we take this particular subject. Public opinion and feelings on this are absolutely huge. Look at the size of the demonstrations, look at the numbers of people signing petitions, look at the number of people that are directly contacting us. And the Amnesty International briefing sent for this debate should be required reading for all members, because Amnesty measures its words very, very carefully in the way it puts it, very careful not to take an overtly political opinion, but goes on in devastating detail to point out that the International Court of Justice, meeting in The Hague, has concluded that acts of genocide have been taking place, that the International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for the Prime Minister of Israel and 2 other people, and that the argument that is being used by Britain over the continuing supply of weapons and arms equipment to Israel is utterly fallacious. The argument over the supply of parts for F-35 jets claims that it is impossible to separate out those parts that are supplied to Israel from those parts that are supplied to other places that are using F-35 jets. I cannot believe that the manufacturers and the government and the Ministry of Defence do not have a highly detailed account of every single piece of equipment that's supplied to Israel and every single piece of equipment that goes into those planes. It is perfectly possible to identify them. I give way.
Diane Abbott.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend. People in Hackney and actually countrywide feel very strongly about this issue. But does he agree with me that far from moving towards a two-state solution, Israel is deliberately trying to disrupt it with the settlements on the West Bank and the annexation of the Golan Heights?
Jeremy Corbyn.
Indeed, my friend is absolutely correct on this. The point I was making was about weapons supplies. I mentioned specifically the F-35 jets, but all the other weapons that are supplied, and others, including the member for Hayes, and others have pointed out that the Royal Air Force Base at Akrotiri has a mysteriously large number of flights taking off from it, going to Israel and coming back 2 hours later. It seems to me they could well be delivering weapons to Israel at this time. And so the point my friend makes is absolutely correct, that Israel's intentions in all of this are to occupy Gaza, to expel the population of Gaza into the Sinai, and thus creating a new Gaza Strip in Sinai. And 20 years' time, we'll be back here again having exactly the same debate about the plight of Palestinian people that have been expelled from their own land. And so I think we need to recognise what public opinion is doing in Britain. I've been on every single one of the 24 national demonstrations that have been held in support of the Palestinian people. They're huge, they're diverse, They're of a pretty wide range of political opinions, but they're all united on the humanitarian case. Those very large blocks of Jews for Justice for Palestine and other groups that are there indicate just the diversity of it. A petition asking us to have a debate is one thing. Is it to be a safety valve for public opinion, where Parliament's had a debate on it, that's the end of the matter, or is it going to be a call to action? And I look forward to the Minister replying, telling us that there will be a suspension of all arms supplies to Israel.
Richard Bergen.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. We can't carry on with a business-as-usual approach to Israel. That's become a green light for war crimes, and that's why 60 MPs and Lords from 7 parties recently called on the Foreign Secretary to introduce sanctions, and that's what needs to be done. I want to use my time today to put on record in this House the submission made by the government in the latest High Court hearing into the legality of ongoing exports of F-35 fighter jet parts that end up in Israel. The government has accepted that Israel is, and I quote, not committed to compliance with international humanitarian law in Gaza, including in the conduct of hostilities. That, and I quote again, the overall picture was of obvious concern, especially having regard to the number of civilian casualties, and that there is a clear risk that F-35 components might be used to commit or facilitate a serious violation of international humanitarian law. Yet the government concludes that these exports should nonetheless continue. It's important that we today address this head-on. The government has decided to carve out F-35 exports from its own licensing criteria that are meant to ensure adherence to international law. But international law cannot be opted in and out of at will, and nor can our own laws. The F-35s are the main military export to Israel, and they have been used to drop the deadliest bombs on Gaza, and they've been used since the beginning of the war. The sale of these arms is not only in flagrant violation of international law, but is totally immoral and leaves Britain complicit in the war crimes. These arms must cease to be sold. The sale of these arms must end. So I hope the Minister today will answer some very specific questions. In the Business and Trade Committee last week, the government admitted all F-35 parts in the global spares pool are in fact tracked by the US government. So question number one, does the UK government have access to this information? If not, why not? And has it asked for it? Question number two, does the UK government know what portion of F-35 parts that the UK exported to the global spares pool have ended up in Israel since the 7th of October 2023? And question number three, is the Minister certain that neither domestic nor international law is being violated with this carve-out? I also want to put on record that I've been told by lawyers that the ongoing export of F-35 parts leaves workers in Britain, including civil servants in government departments, at risk of being held individually criminally liable for war crimes and other crimes under international law, including genocide. So I'd like a very clear answer from the Minister today, from the government, as to whether the government have provided legal advice to workers on this. How is the government planning to protect the civil servants and other workers who export F-35 parts which end up in Israel from potential complicity in breaches of international humanitarian law? These are important questions, and I look forward to them being answered by the Minister today.
Mike Tapp.
Thank you, Madam Chair. These petitions reflect the deep concern and passion of many in our society about the ongoing conflict and suffering in the Middle East, and I respect the sentiment behind them. This government is already working towards the same objectives that many signatories of these petitions seek: an end to the violence in Gaza, the immediate release of all remaining hostages, improved supply of humanitarian aid, and crucially, irreversible progress towards a lasting two-state solution. Peace in the Middle East will come from negotiations, dialogue, and the willingness of both sides to find common ground. Now let me turn first to the question of recognising the State of Palestine. Both the Israeli and Palestinian peoples have a legitimate right to self-determination. The foundation of a two-state solution is an independent, viable and democratic Palestine living alongside a safe and secure Israel. Since the Oslo Accords, the principle has been clear. A two-state solution can only be reached through direct negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians. An action that undermines this principle, such as unilateral recognition of Palestine by the UK, only complicates that matter and makes peace more difficult. It creates the false impression that a Palestinian state can be imposed from the outside without the necessary negotiations. Unilateral recognition, as seen with countries like Spain, Norway and Ireland, has led to no real progress on the ground. It's a symbolic gesture, but it does not advance the cause of peace. On the matter of arms export, we must also approach this with a clear-eyed view of the facts. Revoking UK arms export licences would once again be a largely symbolic gesture with very little practical impact on the situation in Gaza. It would also undermine our credibility as a security partner in the region and send the wrong messages to adversaries, including Iran. I give way.
MacDonald.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way, but presumably you will recognise that 15% of the F-35 construction parts come from the United Kingdom, and they are the choice of delivery of the £2,000 bombs that obliterate civilian populations in Gaza. And does he also share my concern that by continuing to participate in that programme, that leaves the United Kingdom at risk of being prosecuted under various conventions for complicity in those heinous acts?
Mike Tapp.
I thank the honourable member for his intervention. We must bear in mind 95% of weapons come from the US and Germany. And on the legal side of things, Keir Starmer and the government have been clear that they've consulted legal advice, which of course will continue, and I expect there'll be more from the Minister on that. This is not to say we ignore the suffering or the rights of Palestinians, far from it. But revoking arms sale to Israel, particularly when the country is engaged in 7-front conflict against Iran and its proxies, would undermine our national security interests in the Middle East. The UK has a long-standing defence and security relationship with Israel, and that relationship has played a key role in defending Israel against an unprecedented Iranian ballistic attack earlier this year. We have a real-world experience in peace-building through initiatives like the International Fund for Ireland, which invested in cross-community projects in Northern Ireland long before the Good Friday Agreement was signed. Over time, these projects helped change attitudes and foster the conditions for political leaders to negotiate and compromise. The UK can and must apply these lessons to the Middle East. By supporting peace-building civil society organisations in both Israel and Palestine, we can build the foundations for lasting peace. This approach has already received the backing from the G7 and was reinforced by the Prime Minister's recent announcement on supporting civil society peace-building. I urge us all to focus on actions that have a tangible long-term impact. Unilateral recognition of Palestine or the withdrawal of arms exports to Israel may offer a moment of symbolic protest, but we will not move us closer to a genuine and lasting peace. The real path to peace lies in dialogue, supporting peace-building initiatives and encouraging both Israelis and Palestinians to come to the table. The UK can play a meaningful role in this by investing in projects that build trust and create the conditions necessary for a sustainable two-state solution. Thank you, Madam.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Ms. Harris, for the honours
to serve under your chairship. I would like to keep my remarks to talking about arms exports today. But before I do, I first want to recognise what an appalling atrocity the 7th of October 2023 was. And I also want to talk about the 101 hostages who are still held captive, including the British citizen Emily Demare. And I, like the British government, demand their immediate release. I've just got back from King Charles Street, where the Foreign Affairs Committee this afternoon was visiting the consular team. And it's plain that they do really sensitive work, working with families of British hostages held overseas. But my remarks about the arms exports to Israel are largely based on the sitting of the Department for Business and Trade Committee that took place last Tuesday, the 9th of December. I was a guest at that committee meeting from the Foreign Affairs Committee. And the Foreign Affairs Committee has been carrying out 2 inquiries, one on the Middle East and one on soft power. And what we found was that the British soft power has been very damaged by this aspect of not fully complying with international law. This is undermining the UK's reputation if we are not going to pursue international law consistently.
He makes a very powerful point about international law. Would he agree with me that actually the judgment that we all need to now look at is that ICJ advisory opinion on the occupation? And the question this government needs to answer is, yes, they're working through the process of understanding what that means, including potentially banning illegal settlement goods. But what is taking so long? Because our reputation has suffered hugely as a result of the prevarication, particularly from the last government, and now it's up to this government to repair it.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, and she's absolutely right. The advisory opinion of the ICJ is crucial here, and the government really needs to crack on with its rulings in the light of that. My remarks are about the carve-out for the F-35 fighter jet, and specifically the 5 licences that are somehow exempt in terms of international law. These licences are under what's called open general licences. That is, they can be of an indefinite duration and of an unlimited quantity. The British state does not have to set out what sorts of quantities of weapons are being exported. Now, at the Business and Trade Committee last week, we heard ministers from the FCDO, but also from Business and Trade and from Defence, talking about how, well, the F-15 is different because it's merely... sorry, the F-35 is different because 15% of it is British, the other 85% of it is produced by a collaboration involving Italy, the Netherlands, the US, Canada, Norway, Denmark, Turkey, Australia. And by the way, we only contribute the ejector seats, the batteries and the rear parts of the tail. The point is, we in the West have to abide by international law. We have to do this. We've been, as the British government, asking for an immediate ceasefire since the 4th of July. My party has been calling for that for a great deal longer in the Liberal Democrats. But the British government is not being listened to by Israel. And in the absence of any influence, the UK government needs to take the next step. Those who allege that it's somehow contradictory to ask Israel to stop using these arms, while also having to defend itself from Iran, I'd like to take up that point. I'm actually very proud of the fact that the UK was instrumental in defending Israel from the attack by Iran last April. But I see no contradiction here whatsoever. The withholding of arms exports to Israel is a lever of policy that we now have to pull. Finally, we have to remember here that we are talking here about the principle of distinction. It's a very firm principle in international humanitarian law that every British soldier is taught, the principle of distinguishing between combatants and non-combatants. And we've seen from evidence gathered by Danish NGOs that we've seen 2,000-pound bombs delivered by F-35 fighter jets that killed, for example, 90 Palestinians at the Al-Mawasi camp on the 13th of July.
little surprise, really, because a £2,000 bomb will kill people within a radius of 360 metres of that detonation. The British government is failing to comply with international humanitarian law. It needs to abide by the principle of distinction. We need to abide by international law. Thank you.
Ian Budd.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Chair, under your chairship. Hand Rajab was a 5-year-old Palestinian girl. Her family were fleeing Gaza City when their car came under attack. The first shot killed Hind's aunt, uncle and 3 of her cousins. Just Hind and her 15-year-old cousin, Ryan, were left alive. Trapped in the car and surrounded by the bodies of dead relatives, Ryan phoned for help. The recording of her call with the Palestinian Red Crescent was later released. They are shooting at us. The tank is next to me, Ryan told the operator. Ryan's last moments were then heard, machine gun fire, a scream, and then the phone went dead. The Red Crescent phoned back. 5-year-old Hind answered. She was now alone in the car. The cousin was dead, and Israeli forces were still close by. I'm so scared, please come, Hind told the operator. For 3 hours, Hind pleaded to be rescued. Come take me, will you come take me? As it grew dark, she told the operator how frightened she was. Eventually, Israeli authorities gave the green light for a Palestinian Red Crescent ambulance to be dispatched to their rescue. When it arrived, the ambulance was attacked and contact was lost. 2 weeks passed before the bodies of Hind, her family and the 2 paramedics were recovered, all are being killed by Israeli forces. In the aftermath of these horrific events, images of Hind's beautiful smile and the recording of her final moments caught the world's attention. Next month marks a year since Hind was killed. Since then, the slaughter of the Palestinians has not stopped. Hind is one of more than 17,000 children killed in Israeli assaults and one of more than 45 Palestinians of all ages killed. A study published last week found that 96% of children in Gaza believe their death is imminent. And following the trauma they've been subjected to, the study found that almost half want to die. A new report by Amnesty International has concluded that Israelis' actions in Gaza constitutes genocide. Last month, Human Rights Watch said Israel had committed ethnic cleansing against Palestinians in Gaza. In January, the International Court of Justice found there was a plausible risk of genocide in Gaza. And in July, the court said Israel's occupation of Palestine breached the International Convention that guards against segregation and apartheid. The Israeli Prime Minister and his former Defence Secretary are now wanted by the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity. And so, Chair, no one in this place can say they did not know what was happening or that the facts were unclear. We know what's happening in Gaza. It is an unthinkable, unspeakable horror. The time for expressions of regret and concern are long past. International law is clear and urgent action is needed. This means ending all arms sales to Israel, including parts for the F-35 fighter jets that are raining down hell in Gaza, and has been explained throughout this chamber today. It means sanctioning Israel and boycotting trade with illegal Israeli settlements. It means upholding the ICC's arrest warrants, and it means revoking the 2030 roadmap, which deepens economic trade and security ties with Israel. These measures will go some way in showing that here in Britain we recognise our shared humanity and our legal and moral responsibilities.
Paul Collar.
Thank you, Mr. Pritchard. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I thank the member for South Cotswolds for opening this debate and for the petitioners for calling it. I believe I stand with everyone here today when I say what's happening in Gaza is appalling and unacceptable. The death and devastation has caused anguish around the world and left many, including my constituents in Wimbledon, deeply distressed. The events that started this current cycle of violence on October the 7th must not be forgotten. Hamas's evil attacks are indefensible, and Israel undoubtedly had the right to protect its citizens by targeting these brutal terrorists in accordance with international law. But it is clear, Mr. Chairman, Israel is not acting within international law, and a humanitarian catastrophe is now taking place. Thousands of men, women and children are being killed in Gaza without a peaceful settlement in sight. We cannot stand by and let the current situation continue. Children have lost parents and parents have lost children as a result of Israel's disproportionate response. The killing must stop, and all the hostages released under an immediate bilateral ceasefire. But that alone is not enough, as we desperately and urgently need long-term peace. And to achieve this, we must secure an enduring resolution of the underlying issues. That is why my party and I have long advocated a two-state solution on the 1967 borders and the immediate recognition of a Palestinian state. I consequently echo the cause of my honourable friends. The government must follow the example of our allies, including Spain, Norway and Ireland, in formally recognising a Palestinian state. This alone, of course, will not solve the issues. We must work with the international community, the Palestinian people, to establish a democratic future for Palestine. In my previous role as head of the School of Law at SOAS, I visited Palestine and worked with Palestinian activists and academics who were committed to such a future and united in their view that Hamas did not represent the Palestinian people. Furthermore, the government must take a presumption of denial approach to the sale of arms to any country deemed by the Foreign Office to be breaching international standards on human rights. And we should be doing far more to sanction the settlers and their illegal settlements, which, as I saw with my own eyes, are designed to undermine and make impossible a two-state solution. The world has a duty to act, and we must play our part. Thank you.
Ayub Khan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to be speaking under your chairmanship. Can I first of all thank the Honourable Member for South Cotswold and, of course, the petitioner, Sandra Downs, and all the signatories of the petition up and down this country. I think it's fair to say, Mr. Chair, that we've heard a lot of discussions and statements made by honourable members, all essentially saying pretty much the same thing, that what is taking place in Gaza is a genocide and that the UK government needs to do more. And I think it's almost sickening when we are constantly reminded by some that there is a self-defence or an agenda of self-defence, when everyone, children at schools, get to see what's taking place on social media. They see stories like the Honourable Member mentioned Rajab Hind. More bullets penetrated in that vehicle than she had bones. They see stories like that. And they are outraged by politicians who stand up and somehow provide this smokescreen of self-defence. Self-defence has parameters. Excessive self-defence is no defence. You cannot use that as a method to avoid accountability. And we are constantly reminded by senior political figures, whether in this country or America, that somehow this is self-defence when everybody else can see that it's not. And when we look at the words of Benjamin Netanyahu, Amalek, that's the word he used. You look at some of the video footage that comes out of Gaza. Animals are being shot. Donkeys are being shot so that food cannot reach its destination. Paramedics being killed. There was a recent event where a doctor at a hospital was murdered and raped and put out onto the streets. And some are saying, well, this is all part of the agenda, not to give the Palestinians any recourse to even medical aid, because what have we got? Over 200 aid workers killed, 500 medical staff killed. These are just some of the basic stats which everybody in this country can see. And yet we still have arguments of self-defence. Nothing could be further from the truth, Mr. Chair. And I'm not going to take up too much time because I know other people want to speak, but we have got an opportunity early next year where my colleague Shaukat Adam has presented a bill on the recognition of Palestinian statehood. That is our opportunity to stand up for the rights of the Palestinians. They've suffered far too much.
Leila Moran.
For giving way. And I would say that that bill is really important. I would also point out I've put down a similar bill for every single year that I've been here. And one of the things I found quite remarkable about certain speeches in this room is that it would seem that Palestinian voices do seem to be rather missing or forgotten, or in this case, erased. May I ask him to perhaps look more widely at what's happened in this House more than just this year? These have been decades-long fights that we've been having across party, and most of us here have been trying to do that. Let's continue in that vein.
You've come.
Can I just say, I thank the honourable member and all the endeavours, both of the honourable member and of the Liberal Democrats, because I know that they have been very vocal on this topic. And I know that there may also be another bill in the honourable member's name, which is also asking for a recognition of the Palestinian statehood, something that we should all unite and seek to encourage other parliamentarians to support. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr Pritchard. It's an honour to serve under your chairship. I join my honourable friends in expressing my condolences to all those who have been killed on both sides since October 7th, but since 1948. And I join in the condemnation of all war crimes committed by any state actor or group. As Israel launches a land grab in Syria and continues to bomb Lebanon, there is a danger its continuing actions in Gaza will get lost in the egregious cycle of death and destruction in the Middle East. It is timely, therefore, that we discuss yet again what contribution the UK can make to peace in the region. Unfortunately, the record of this government to date has been abysmal. As mentioned by my honourable friends, the UK continues to supply spare parts to F-35 fighter jets, playing a major part in the Israeli military offensive. And it refuses to introduce any meaningful actions. Words, condolences, and reports of meetings and pressing Israeli officials to do more. This is not enough. And there is much more that the UK can do. Worse, in its refusal to admit the nature of the military offensive in Gaza, this government is culpable in the mass murder taking place. Our Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary may not understand what constitutes acts of genocide in international law, but thankfully human rights organisations do. We have heard about the recent Amnesty International report, which is unequivocal. Israeli actions against Gaza's 2.3 million population is genocide. There is also note how the Israeli government are acting with impunity. Our government, the US, and other allies to Israel have granted Israel immunity from war crimes, ethnic cleansing and genocide for decades. Today is the day that must stop. The British government must end its complicity in the Israeli war crimes and in the genocide that is taking place. Our role must be to challenge the arrogance and complacency of Israel and send a message that Palestine exists. Its people have a right to live free of occupation and to have a state of their own. This government claims it is committed to a two-state solution, and so is everybody in this room, but they have taken no meaningful action to make it a reality. The recognition of a Palestinian state is therefore a prerequisite for peace. The reply normally given to the ask to recognise Palestine, that this is not the right time to recognise a Palestinian state, but I think from all the strong and passionate and powerful speeches we have heard, the time is now. We know from our own experience of the peace process in Northern Ireland, it is too simple to reduce political violence to irrational hatred or religious bigotry. Where you have a political conflict, you have political reasons to create a pathway to those solutions. This government can help create that pathway both by stopping its supply of spare parts to F-35 fighter jets and all other weapons, and by joining with the vast majority of the UN members in formally recognising a Palestinian state. Thank you.
We now move on to the front benches, 10 minutes each. Monica Harding.
Thank you, Chair. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I am pleased to be at this debate to discuss these two very important petitions, and I want to thank my honourable friend, the member for South Cotswolds, for moving this debate. The Liberal Democrats have been calling for an immediate bilateral ceasefire since November 2023, one which will put an end to the humanitarian devastation in Gaza, get the hostages out, and provide an opportunity for a political process towards a two-state solution based on the 1967 borders. A lasting peace and two states is the only way to guarantee the dignity and security which both the Palestinians and Israelis deserve. So, speaking in relation to the first petition, which calls for the UK to recognise the State of Palestine, I can proudly say that this is something the Liberal Democrats have long been calling for, and we support immediate recognition of the State of Palestine. UK allies have increasingly been recognising the State of Palestine, and the UK should join them, with the hope of refocusing attention on efforts to find a political solution to the war in the Middle East. Recognition of Palestine is particularly important right now, given the threats of some in Israel that have been noted by the ICC and the ICJ, like that of Minister Smotrich, seeking to annex the West Bank. I recently visited the occupied Palestinian territories in November and saw firsthand the expanding settlements and growing violence there. Recognising Palestine on 1967 lines would make clear where the United Kingdom stands in relation to this. As my honourable friend, the member for South Cotswolds, pointed out, recognising Palestine is a tool which will inject hope into Palestinian society that having their own state is possible. They are far from hope just now, and it is essential that we signal that we support statehood for them. I believe it will help wrest control back from the extremes at the edges of Palestinian society. This, as has been pointed out, is not a byproduct of a solution, it is the route to a solution. And it must be stated that Hamas can have no part in the governance of this Palestinian state. Thank you.
I'm extremely grateful to her for giving way, and she's entirely right that within Palestine this is seen as a prerequisite for what might come next. It doesn't replace, it's not top-down, it's something that's deeply felt and in fact was promised to the Palestinian people when my great-grandfather was alive. But would she also recognise that alongside a state there needs to be viable democratic elections, and that would be made much easier if everyone in Palestine were allowed to vote in them, which is what stopped the last ones from happening. They weren't.
Monica Harding.
I support my honourable friend and pay tribute to the work she has done in this debate, and also agree with her. To turn now, then, to the second petition, to immediately revoking all licences for arms exports to Israel. I fully support this, and this is something my party has been calling the UK government to implement since April this year. Tougher controls of UK arms exports are vital to ensure that they are not used in potential human rights breaches, and I support the introduction of a presumption of denial for all governments listed in the FCDO Human Rights and Democracy report as human rights priorities. As a result, arms exports to Israel should be halted. I know that the Minister has long avoided responding to questions from colleagues of mine calling for clarity on the UK's position to seize all arms exports to Israel, so I hope that we will hear a clearer response from the Minister today. I'll give way.
That's right.
For giving way. And I would just like to point out that there are sometimes small actions that can take place that might help. I know that a number of my constituents were incredibly concerned about the fact that there was premises that were owned by my local council, and the council has actually relinquished its interest in the building that was occupied by a company that was perceived by our constituents to be administratively involved in supplying parts involved in the arms business And I just wondered if you would recognise that, if she would recognise that.
Monica Harding.
I thank my honourable friend for her intervention, and I would like the Minister to note that members have spoken today about workers in the United Kingdom making these parts and their unease with it. As the Right Honourable Member for Birmingham Hodge Hill pointed out, the UK government has made a choice in its export of F-35 components, and that choice is not in line with its international commitments and obligations under international humanitarian law. As the Liberal Democrat spokesperson on international development, I must also use this opportunity to emphasise my deep concern regarding laws passed in Israel's Knesset banning UNRWA in a situation that couldn't be more desperate. As the Under-Secretary-General for Humanitarian Affairs and UN Emergency Relief Coordinator starkly warns, the entire population of North Gaza is at risk of dying. This move, if enacted, would lead to the death of innocent Palestinian civilians. UNRWA plays a critical role in distributing humanitarian aid within Gaza, and this move risks catastrophic consequences. As well as words of condemnation, I ask the Minister here today to set out the consequences for breaching international law and urge the government to consider sanctioning Ministers Ben-Gvir and Smotrich for their incitement of violence against Palestinians by illegal settlers. The government must continue to provide support to UNRWA to address the humanitarian crisis at hand, as well as ensuring that the recommendations of the Kelowna report are implemented as soon as possible. My last point is one that I hope the Minister agrees with and acts upon, is that increasing international development funding is a critical way in which the UK government can be tackling the humanitarian crises that are as a result of conflicts like this that are driving the cause of the petitions being debated today. As the Liberal Democrat spokesperson on international development, I must urge the UK government to strengthen the UK's aid and development response. Overseas aid spending is at its lowest in 17 years, having been cut by a further £2 billion in this fiscal year by this government, and lower than the last Conservative government, despite the Prime Minister previously promising to reset Britain's place in the world and return to our status as an international development and aid superpower. The UK's funding for health programmes and the Humanitarian Relief Reserve Fund, both of which have been cut, urgently need to be restored, so the UK can improve its response to conflict and support the victims of this devastating war in the Middle East. Not only were these programmes eroded in the years since UK ODA was cut from 0.7% of GNI to 0.58% by the Conservative government, but this government has slashed it again to 0.5%. The UK's government, United Kingdom support is needed more than ever, given global conflicts and humanitarian disasters, and so I call on the government to restore ODA assistance of 0.7% of GNI as soon as possible to reinstate the country's commitment to the world's poorest by ensuring that the UK is a global leader on aid and development. Chair, I will end where I started. The Liberal Democrats call for an immediate recognition of a Palestinian state, the return of the hostages, a halt to all arms exports to Israel, and every effort and pressure brought to bear by the government on Israel to get the humanitarian assistance in now. Thank you.
Madam Minister.
Thank you, Mr Pritchard, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship this afternoon. And I'm grateful to be able to speak today on behalf of His Majesty's official opposition today. I'd like to start by thanking the Petitions Committee and the petitioners for bringing forward this important debate on these two petitions. This is quite clearly a matter of concern to constituents up and down the country, as well as across this House. The Conservatives support a two-state solution that guarantees security and stability for both the Israeli and the Palestinian people. It is right that the people of the West Bank and Gaza should have the political perspective of a credible route to a Palestinian state and a new future. Our long-standing position is that we will recognise a Palestinian state at a time that is most conducive to that peace process. We are not at that point now. And we are clear that recognition cannot be the start of the process. Hamas is still being fought in parts of Gaza while Israeli hostages remain in captivity. Ensuring Hamas is no longer in charge of Gaza and removing their capacity to launch attacks against Israel are essential and unavoidable steps on the road to a lasting peace. The steps we must take now include getting the hostages out and getting more aid in. This is crucial for making progress to a sustainable end of the current conflict. The suffering of the hostages is utterly intolerable for Israel, and it should be intolerable for any person and any government that cares about human dignity and human rights. Let me be very clear. Hamas could release those hostages now, immediately and unconditionally. We must also do more to support the innocent civilians of Gaza who are suffering and who are desperate. They continue to be used as human shields by Hamas, who have no regard at all for their safety and welfare. We continue to call for more humanitarian aid to enter Gaza and, importantly, improved access through existing routes. The Conservative government helped to identify different ways that aid could get in, and we appointed a special representative for humanitarian affairs in the occupied Palestinian territories, who was on the ground and had a remit to try and address the bottlenecks to aid delivery. We came up with clear proposals and we put them to the government of Israel, including in relation to aid delivery through Ashdod and Erez, as well as Kerem Shalom and the Jordan Land Corridor. Israel did make a number of significant and welcome commitments on these points, as well as on approving more types of aid. But fulfilment of those commitments, Mr Pritchard, is vital, and we are monitoring developments closely. But turning to arms export licences, the last Conservative government reviewed advice about the situation in Gaza and Israel, and our assessments left the UK's position on arms export licences to Israel unchanged. Our position in government was in line with many of our partners who have also not taken the decision to suspend existing arms export licences to Israel. The Labour government's decision to announce an arms embargo on the day that Israeli hostage families buried 6 of their loved ones, and weeks after an Iranian attack in which we helped defend Israel, is difficult to swallow. And then weeks later, Iran attacked again. Decisions such as this have also broader geopolitical implications, and we must be clear that there is no moral equivalence between Hamas and the democratically elected government of Israel. Our assessment was that the government's move was designed to satisfy its backbenchers while not defending Israel, but it looks to have failed on both accounts, particularly in light of the subsequent direct attack by Iran. The decision was evidently poorly timed and ill-judged. Labour has suspended export licences as Israel fends off threats from a terror group prescribed by the UK as well as from Iran. This is despite the government confessing it has not been possible to reach a determinative judgment on allegations regarding Israel's conduct of hostilities. Mr Pritchard, returning to the subject of the future, we recognise that an effective Palestinian Authority could have an important role to play in building a lasting peace and progressing towards a two-state solution. Lord Cameron of Chipping Norton, as Foreign Secretary, spoke with the new Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority, Mohammed Mustafa, and offered the UK's support for implementing much-needed reforms. Indeed, we are very clear. The Palestinian Authority needs serious reform to its education and welfare policies, and it needs to show democratic progress. And just as the Palestinian Authority must act, so must Israel. This means releasing frozen funds, halting settlement expansion, and holding to account those responsible for extremist settler violence. So, Mr Pritchard, to conclude and to reiterate, we continue to want to see a sustainable end to the conflict in Gaza, securing the release of the hostages and doing more to get humanitarian aid to innocent Palestinian civilians. And ultimately, we want to be able to lift people's eyes to the brighter future and regional peace. Thank you.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's an honour to serve under your chairmanship. I'm grateful to the Petitions Committee for securing this debate and to the Honourable Member for South Cotswolds for leading it. I thank other Honourable Members for their contributions. They've represented their views and those of their constituents, many of whom I know have signed these petitions with sincerity. With your forbearance, Chair, and recognising the many, many pages of questions that I've received over the course of the afternoon, I'll try and make some progress through my remarks before taking interventions. I recognise the tone both of the petitions and the questions and contributions this afternoon. I think this House is united in wanting to end the agonies in Gaza, return the hostages, end the violent expansion of settlements, and secure a two-state solution. That is my work and the work of this government, and I'm grateful to the spokesman for the opposition for highlighting how different our approach is to that of the government that preceded us. When we became the government, we called for an immediate ceasefire. On my first day as a minister, we restored funding to UNRWA. We have now provided £41 million to UNRWA, recognising their vital work, as some of the speakers have outlined. We have taken a different approach on questions of international law, both in relation to the ICC, the ICJ, and in our votes in the UN Security Council. Even where those resolutions have been defeated, we have been clear on our commitment to international humanitarian law and the need for a two-state solution. And in relation to sanctions on both settlers and settlements, we have taken far-reaching action, which I'll cover briefly in my remarks. I'd also like to say something, given how strongly so many of our constituents feel about these issues. I am a Labour member and a Labour minister, and Labour MPs send me the videos, the photos, the many, many reports that I know constituents see every day in the way that many people have referred to. I see these too. As a Labour member, as a Labour minister, I am never far from the reality of the situation, and I'm grateful to my colleagues for helping make sure that that is the case. I want to turn briefly to the petitions that we're debating today and try to give substantive answers to them both, and then I'll take interventions. Firstly, on the call for immediate recognition, I want to make clear this government is unequivocal in its support for recognition and of a two-state solution. Palestinian statehood, as my honourable friend said, is the right of the Palestinian people. It is not in the gift of any neighbour, and it is vital, as the honourable member has set out, that the people of the West Bank and Gaza are given the political perspective of a credible route to a Palestinian state. We are committed to recognising a Palestinian state, and we will do so at the time most conducive to the long-term prospects for peace. We must take this step when we think it will make the greatest contribution to bring about the reality of a sovereign Palestinian state alongside a secure Israel, which I know is the end goal that we all agree upon. Many members have referenced the decisions of other allies, and we watch those carefully and we discuss these issues as you would expect diplomatically. But simply saying a thing does not make it so, and it is the practical questions that this government is driving its efforts towards, creating the conditions necessary for a two-state solution to become a reality. The Prime Minister reiterated that commitment and to supporting reforms in the Palestinian Authority that I think were mentioned by a number of members when he met with President Abbas in September. And the honourable member asks about our support for Israel's security. Of course, it remains steadfast, as well as their right to self-defence against terrorism and state threats. But as we have repeatedly said, it must do so in accordance with international law. We have taken decisive action against extremist Israeli settlers who undermine the viability of a two-state solution, and we have called out the unacceptable rhetoric of some Israeli ministers. As members have said, settlement expansion and violence has reached record levels. The Israeli government has seized more of the West Bank in 2024 than in the past 20 years. That is completely unacceptable. We have recently sanctioned 3 illegal outposts and 4 organisations that have supported and sponsored violence against communities in the West Bank. Those are sanctions not just focused on the violence, but on the settlements themselves, which are contrary to international law. We will continue to take action necessary to challenge those who undermine a two-state solution. And on the question of sanctions that have raised, I'm afraid, as a way that the members will be familiar, I won't provide a commentary on who we may target with sanctions, but I would just reassure this chamber that we will continue to take the action necessary. Let me turn to the call in the second petition to revoke all licences for arms exports to Israel. I recognise the strength of feeling. It's why on day one we commissioned a review into Israel's commitment and compliance with international humanitarian law and took decisive action where the review found possible breaches. On the 2nd of September, the Foreign Secretary announced to Parliament that decision, and it followed a conclusion that there is a clear risk of items being used in violation of IHL. Let me be clear, this is not a partial suspension. This is a full suspension of all licences for equipment for use in military operations in Gaza. I'll come to the F-35 point shortly. But on the remaining licences which are not in relation to the F-35s, this is body armour for journalists and NGOs, equipment for re-export to close allies, items utilised for training and never intended to see conflict. These are the remaining military licences to Israel. It's not right, in my view, to suspend those when there is no clear risk that they could be used in the ongoing conflict. The majority of licences to Israel are not to the IDF, and they are not military equipment. Under this government's watch, there are no extant licences that could be used by Israel to commit or facilitate a serious violation of international humanitarian law in the Gaza conflict. All of this is subject to the specific measures set out in Parliament, including excluding exports to the global F-35 programme from the scope of the suspension. Now, I see some members have questioned this, but let me be clear about the view of the government. Suspending F-35 licences could not be done without prejudicing the F-35 programme. My honourable friend asks about how that My right honourable friend asks about how that's consistent with the law, and he refers to some of the opening speeches in the ongoing judicial review. I will not comment in great deal about the judicial review, which is obviously considering these legal questions in greater detail, but he refers to the Arms Trade Treaty. The question of the Arms Trade Treaty in the section he refers to asks us to tend to questions of international peace and security. We have been clear in the House, and I'm clear again today, that to bring down the F-35 programme would have significance to international peace and security. It would have a broader strategic role in NATO, I will in a second, and it would also affect Western equipment support for Ukraine. This is not an arbitrary decision we have taken. We will keep this and all aspects of our policy under close review. I will give way.
I'm very grateful to my friend for giving way. Will he please accept from the people who make this argument that there is strength in it, that it's the end user of the F-34 programme that's the issue here. There is no suggestion that the UK should withdraw from the programme entirely, but there be a block on the end user because it's those F-35s that are delivering the 2,000-pound bombs that are renting asunder civilian communities in Gaza, and we must play our part in making sure that doesn't happen any longer. Will you please accept that?
Yes. So, I want to be clear to my honourable friend and to everybody here that where we are directly selling F-35 parts to Israel, where we were selling parts directly, that is now suspended. It is indirectly where we are not in a position to determine the end user. Now, I hear that members are saying that they think that we could determine the end user. I just need to reiterate the position of the government that the global supply chain is critical to the operation of the F-35 programme, that we cannot suspend licences to end users in the way that my honourable friend would like us to, without imperiling this.
I'm grateful to the Minister who's been characteristically generous. The reason I understand it is we can't track F-35 parts is because we have signed a contract that basically renders us blind when they leave our borders. Technically, it is possible, and the Ministry of Defence has said that. But the question I think the Minister has got to answer is that Section 7 of the Arms Trade Treaty is very clear. It says that if there's a risk, an overriding risk of a breach of IHL, then exports should not be made. The Minister's own submission, his government's own submission to the courts, is that that risk exists. We can't have it both ways.
Minister. So I think my right honourable friend is making two distinct arguments. One is you do know where the end user is, but you can't practically stop it. But you can also maintain the F-35 programme. The position of the government is we cannot take action on the global spares pool without bringing the F-35 programme into peril, with implications for international peace and security. That is the position of the government. In relation to the section of the Arms Trade Treaty to which he refers, it is clear that consideration needs to be given to international peace and security, and it is on that basis that we have set out our position. And I think another member asked me about the legal advice. We have set out the legal position as clearly as we possibly can, more clearly, I think, than any previous government ever has on such a decision. It is being tested in the courts. We are proceeding with the utmost of transparency on these questions. I will give way.
Is it not the case, however, that the review itself was drawn very narrowly, just on Gaza, and it wasn't looking at the West Bank? And we know that there are violations and issues that are happening in the West Bank, and that they're getting worse and worse. Would the government consider increasing the scope of its review, and perhaps doing it again, given that everything is under review, to include the West Bank? Because I rather suspect there'll be more than 30 export licences that might be suspended if that were included.
Minister.
Thank you. I can confirm to the honourable member that I've satisfied, with the exception of the F-35 position which we've just discussed, I've satisfied myself that the review conducted in relation to Gaza also covers the arms licences that could be used both in the West Bank and indeed in the conflict in Lebanon. So the suspension announced on the 2nd September, I've satisfied myself that that would cover the I'm conscious that I have hardly a minute left, so I'm going to wrap up and then try and provide some time to...
Order. Can I just say, the discretion of the Chair, if the Minister is so minded, he can continue beyond the 10 minutes, given that we have got time, given that some colleagues left, but I'm aware of his busy schedule, so it's entirely in the Minister's hands. Richard Bergen.
Minister, for giving way. The question I raised earlier, so the United States has confirmed that all F-35 parts in the global spares pool are tracked by the United States government. Our government has admitted that too. So does the government have access to this information? If not, why not? If not, has it asked for it? And does the UK government know what proportion or what portion of F-35 parts that the UK exported to the global spares pool have ended up in Israel since October last year?
Minister.
I'm happy to return to my honourable friend in writing on some of these questions of detail, but the position about the F-35s, I mean, the position of the government is we cannot suspend sales to the global spares pool without bringing down the overall programme, and so the international peace and security elements to which I've already referred are very much in scope, but I'm happy to write on the detail of the questions that the honourable friends, my honourable friends asked me, please.
From this, could I just go back to recognition for a moment? The previous government said it will recognise Palestine when it best serves the object of peace. The current government says it will recognise the Palestinian state as a contribution to a renewed peace process. I'm struggling a little to see the difference between those positions. There's a certain amount of sophistry in what the opposition spokesman said, which is that we can't recognise when the hostilities are continuing. We don't recognise states based on which government they have or what is happening there at the moment. We recognise it on the basis of the right to sovereignty, which Palestine clearly has. So what is stopping the government recognising Palestine now, particularly given the Commons vote 10 years ago?
I thank my right honourable friend for his question and recognise his long commitment to these issues. We are committed to recognising the state of Palestine at a point where we think it will make a contribution. I expect that you will continue, and many other members, I expect that the right honourable member will continue to be pressing me on these questions for as long as this Parliament goes on. We want to make a commitment. We want to make a contribution, to an advance of the position towards the two-state solution. That is, as so many members have said this afternoon, feels horribly and dangerously distant at this time, but we think that the recognition of a state of Palestine can make a contribution to that process, and we want to see it on a more stable footing than we are at the current time.
Will the Minister give way?
I won't. I'm going to try and conclude and give the proposer a chance to wrap up. I hope, Chair, that members will see that this government has taken meaningful action to try and alleviate the suffering. I hear both the strength of feeling from the public and indeed from the members in this room. We will continue to do more. We are conscious, deeply conscious, of both the agonies in Gaza and the coming of winter and all of the pressures that will... I'm going to try and just push on if that's okay. We've announced now £112 million for the occupied Palestinian territories this year. We will continue to press for the vital services that civilians in Gaza and the West Bank desperately need. That includes £13 million that the Prime Minister announced our commitment to UNRWA when he met with the Commissioner General Lazzarini on the 11th of December, as I understand it, the first ever Prime Minister to meet with an UNRWA Commissioner General. We have continually supported hostage talks, and I welcome the reference to the British national still detained by Hamas by a fellow member. We will continue to work alongside our allies and partners in the region, exercising every possible diplomatic lever to see them immediately and unconditionally released. We have, as I said, imposed sanctions against those perpetrating and inciting human rights abuses against Palestinian communities in the West Bank, and since July, sanctioned 3 illegal outposts and 4 organisations. I also welcome the comment from one member about the importance of peace-building efforts and...
Would the Minister give you on the illegal outposts? I'm just grateful because he's mentioned it several times. 3 illegal outposts and 4 organisations. All outposts in the West Bank are illegal. Why are we not, as a nation, taking much more strenuous action against all illegal occupation of the West Bank and the occupied territories?
Minister. I thank my honourable friend for the opportunity to reiterate Britain's policy, or this government's policy towards the West Bank. It is occupied Palestinian territory. That is clear in international law. There is no dispute about that. The sanctions that we imposed had quite far-reaching implications, including organisations which are involved on a broad and sort of structural basis in helping construct settlements. So I hope that there is no ambiguity about our position. Now I'm going to push through to the end now. Just last month, the Foreign Secretary chaired a UN Security Council Ministerial meeting to focus international attention on the urgent need for a ceasefire and the release of all hostages. On the 20th of November, we voted in favour of the draft UN Security Council resolution on Gaza proposed by the 10 countries elected to the Council. We reiterated our unwavering commitment to the vision of the two-state solution where 2 democratic states, Israel and Palestine, live side by side in peace. That is what we will continue to press for with our international partners at every opportunity. Thank you.
Dr. Roz Savage to wind up.
Thank you. I want to thank the petitioners, especially Sandra, for their courage in bringing these petitions and for their commitment to peace. It was an honour to bring this petition to Westminster Hall, and I hope that we've done justice to the gravity of this issue and the seriousness of the dire situation facing all those caught up in the appalling conflict in the Middle East. I thank colleagues for their thoughtful and knowledgeable contributions and their compassion for the people of Israel and Palestine. And I especially thank those colleagues who have shown their commitment to the cause of peace in the Middle East over many years now. The stories we've heard this afternoon are harrowing, and the government must take them seriously. I urge the Minister to engage directly with the specific proposals made today, with the ultimate goal of securing an immediate bilateral ceasefire and a 2-state solution, and to prioritise the resolution of the desperate humanitarian crisis over supply chains. I hope this debate marks not the end of the conversation, but the beginning of meaningful change. Let us not let this moment pass without action. Thank you.
Yeah.
The question is that this House has considered E-petition 653, 509 and 652, 949 relating to Israel and Palestine. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Or contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting stands adjourned. Have a good evening.